One of the first examples in Umberto Eco's famous essay, The Open Work, The Poetics of the Open Work, is Luciano Berio's Sequenza No. 1 for solo flute from 1958. In the sequenza, the score provides information on pitch, height, and intensity, as well as rhythmic proportions, but note durations within the given framework are left open to performers. The first sequenza became one of Eco's exemplars for opera aperta, or the open work, a category of musical and literary works distinguished by presenting an especially broad field of interpretive possibilities to performers, listeners, and readers. In 1992, Berio composed a closed version of the sequenza and published this revision later in 1998 in traditional notation, limiting the freedoms that this work allows performers. A few years before composing the closed sequenza, Berio said in an interview that he hopes, quote, to rewrite sequenza 1 in rhythmic notation. Maybe it will be less open and more authoritarian, but at least it will be reliable. And I hope that Umberto Eco will forgive me, end quote. Berio expresses his caution towards the idea of the open work in music also in his Norton lectures, in which he suggests that, quote, the good old vast and indefinable open work can be valuable as a pedagogical tool. In this paper, I argue that the open work, albeit a revised and uniquely musical version of the concept, is a useful framework for understanding Berio's compositional poetics. I focus on a little discussed composition from 1996 titled Ekpharsis and subtitled Continuo 2, and its predecessor, Continuo for Orchestra, which was composed 5 years earlier. I explore Berio's motivations for composing Ekpharsis through his idiosyncratic conception of translation as a creative force inherent in human understanding. I argue that Continuo and Ekpharsis transmute Berio's conception of artistic creativity, which is characterized by multiple expressions of a single musical idea, a conception that was likely influenced by literary critic George Steiner's theory of translation. While the open work, according to Eco, is associated with certain performative freedoms, Continuo and Ekpharsis suggest a different understanding of the open work in which Berio takes the role of both composer and performer and creates multiple fully composed interpretations of the same musical idea. Continuo and Ekpharsis help clarify our understanding of Berio's compositional practice, which consisted of multiple work that I call compositional performances that exist side by side, with each composition providing another perspective on a single musical object. Paul Griffiths briefly mentions Ekpharsis as a revision of Continuo. Reworking a piece into another is characteristic of Berio's style, yet his motivations for this revision are perplexing. The first piece, Continuo for Orchestra, is a dramatically intense yet understated work for a large ensemble featuring expressive melodic lines layered on top of a lush and fluid instrumental soundscape. Ekpharsis unfolds the same melodic lines, which are heard over a slightly changed soundscape of instrumental textures. Ekpharsis adds to Continuo some new instrumentation and a new opening and ending that are still based on Continuo's musical language. The two compositions share much of their structure, harmonic and melodic language, expression, and timbre. I will now play a brief excerpt from each. The first is from about 30 seconds after Continuo's opening from the work's only recording by Chicago Symphony Orchestra conducted by Daniel Barenboim in 1993. This recording, by the way, does not fully adhere to Continuo's published score, and I will say more about this later. excerpt is the parallel moment in Ekpharsis, which is heard about a minute and a half into the recording after a newly added opening. This performance was recorded at the work's world premiere in 1997 by the Frankfurt Radio Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Berio himself. Do you hear how they're almost identical? Listening to continuo and Ekpharsis, it might be easy to sympathize with Griffiths and think of Ekpharsis merely as a revision of continuo. Nevertheless, Berio did not compose Ekpharsis to replace the first continuo, but as two related works that could be performed side by side in the same concert. In contrast to other revised works, Berio published Ekpharsis as an independent composition that exists alongside continuo. In his liner notes for Ekpharsis, Berio describes the work as, quote, a reserved and reflective commentary on an adagio, which I wrote in 1990, end quote. Lydia Gurr offers a radically different perspective on Ekpharsis compared to Paul Griffiths. Gurr proposes that Ekpharsis holds special significance among Berio's works for being a unique instance of musical Ekpharsis, a musical work that takes another work of a different art form as its subject matter. Gurr suggests that Berio's Ekpharsis is a special case of musical Ekpharsis within the same art form, being a musical work that takes another musical work as its subject. For Gurr, Berio's Ekpharsis, quote, offers itself as a doubly self-reflexive, reflective example. It is ekphrastic about Ekpharsis and ultimately produces a picture of Berio's compositional life as a whole. However, I did not find any indications that Berio was aware of or interested in the literary idea of Ekpharsis. In the liner notes to Ekpharsis, the composition, Berio writes that Ekpharsis is the Greek word for expression. In reworking continuo, Ekpharsis brings the Schumann series to mind. Like Ekpharsis, the orchestral Schumann quote their source solo sequences completely with the addition of a new opening and ending. The Schumann realized alternative interpretations of the solo sequences. For example, Berio described Schumann's 4 as, quote, an exposition and amplification of what is implicit, hidden, so to speak, in that solo part, end quote. The Schumann transformed some of the solo sequences into orchestral works. The motivations that led Berio to compose these pieces seem clearly articulated in the works themselves. Ekpharsis, in contrast, keeps continuo's orchestral setting and significantly adds only a new opening and ending without affecting the work's overall harmonic language. Ekpharsis projects continuo in its instrumental, structural, textual, and formal aspects, and thus suggests a Borgesian Pierre Menard-like endeavor by Berio, however, one in which the composer reenacts his own past self to create a new work that would exist side by side with the earlier work. I propose that a key to understanding Berio's motivations for composing Ekpharsis and its significance comes from Berio's idiosyncratic conception of musical translation and its central role in his compositional poetics. In Susanna Pasticci's perceptive investigation of Berio's compositional ethos, she proposes that Berio's conception of creativity is influenced by George Steiner's theory of translation. According to Pasticci, it is likely that Berio draws from Steiner's understanding of translation as a form of interpretation. Steiner's 1975 book offers a broad view of translation. For him, translation is not just transformation between languages, but it is a cognitive mechanism essential to interpretation. Steiner writes, quote, interpretation is that which gives language life beyond the moment and place of immediate utterance or transcription is what I am concerned with. When we read or hear any language statement from the past, we translate. Reader, actor, editor are translators of language out of time, end quote. Berrios' conception of translation in music is similarly broad. He considers musical translation an integral part of interpreting and performing music. He comments that, quote, music is translated when a specific need arises and we are compelled to go from the actual musical experience to its verbal description, from the sound of one instrument to another, or from the silent reading of a musical text to its performance, end quote. Steiner emphasizes the creative aspect of translation. He views translation as a transformation between languages, experiential realms, or periods in time that adds new contexts and meanings to the source text. Musical performance for Steiner is the most radical example of translation since, quote, every musical realization is a new poiesis. It differs from all other performances of the same composition. Its ontological relationship to the original score and to all previous renditions is twofold. It is at the same time reproductive and innovatory, end quote. Berrios considers many of his own compositions as translations, including the Shaman. He remarked in an interview that, quote, the Shaman are my own analysis of a sequenza. They can serve to change the time dimension of a piece because the ensemble or orchestra is commenting before and after the solo. Then I use the Shaman to develop elements in the solo parts that could not possibly be developed on one instrument, end quote. Berrios also refers to musical time dimensions earlier in the interview, stating that some composers are just interested in music as form. I am much more interested in the formational aspect, in music as a process. In order to go deep into the process, the formation of a form, you need these different time dimensions, end quote. Composing a Shaman for Berrios changes its source sequence's time dimension in expressing, like a translation, an act of reproduction that is at the same time innovatory. Recomposing his works allows Berrios to realize the same material in multiple ways and therefore concentrate on the process by which a musical idea takes concrete form. Such a process of formation is also an apt description of the structure of continuo, the predecessor of Ekpharsis. In the work's liner notes, Berrios describes continuo as, quote, a continuous sound space, like a homogeneous surface that unfolds and is sporadically interrupted by large and small windows overlooking an ever-changing set landscape, a hardly habitable, non-permanent, contradictory building, one that is virtually open to a continuous addition of new wings, rooms, and windows, end quote. Listening to continuo can be a disorienting experience. Change of context seems to be the work's subject. I often hear musical events that sound familiar while at the same time new because they are presented in changed tonal and expressive environments. Continuo starts with a repetitive dramatic process, the beginning of which was played earlier in this talk, a process that sounds like a succession of ebbs and flows. A pitch is sustained by multiple instruments using tremolos and trills. Instruments sustaining the pitch come in and out so that its timbre continues to change. The series of sustained pitches as it unfolds in the work is presented on the slide. Berrios' sketches at the Paul Stiftung, by the way, include the top staff of this slide as the basic structure of the piece. Over or under the sustained pitch, melodic lines and fragments are interwoven between instruments, sometimes creating polyphonic textures and other times forming compound melodies of changing timbres. For a short while, dramatic tension grows between the sustained pitch and its harmonic environment. It sounds as if the held pitch is creating a dissonance that needs to be resolved. Then the tension erupts momentarily into an interruption when the ensemble bursts into loud and gushing runs, jagged brass descents, and other contrasting material, which leads the ensemble to settle on another pitch sustained in its flickering state, and the process repeats. In this way, the music's dramatic tension is continuously perpetuated, with the interruptions providing the occasional dramatic jolt that rolls the suspense forward to the next moment. Let's listen to the example from Continuo again and hear a bit of this process. So, that's a sustained pitch. Now the interruption, no pitch is sustained. Now settling on the next one. The pitch material for continuo is a series of 11 pitch classes that unfolds the first rotation in the example. Each pitch class in the series is sustained in turn during one of the sections that I've just described. The series also provides the melodic and harmonic material for each section. Excuse me. However, melodic lines and harmonies are not developed in a systematic manner. Multiplicity of expressions seems to be the organizing principle, with each section exploring a different aspect of the series. The series of sustained pitch classes unfolds 3 times, expressing different ways to realize the line. The first rotation includes 11 sections, each featuring 1 pitch class from the series as the sustained note. The second rotation includes the series of suspensions again, but with some of the interruptions expanded into longer sections, marked with an asterisk in the example. And as a result, the continuous ordered process of ebbs and flows from the first rotation becomes difficult to follow, as it is interrupted by longer stretches of dramatic jolts. In the third rotation, the series breaks apart as only an incomplete portion is heard, which you can see on the bottom line, which is shorter. In this way, structural repetitions gradually become increasingly concealed. Indeed, in his sketches for the piece in PSS, which I had the opportunity to peruse 2 weeks ago, Berrio writes that repetitions in the work should be concealed. Continuous structure reflects an ongoing process of translation on multiple levels, between rotations of the series, and also in melodic repetition between and within sections. Each rotation expresses a different realization or interpretation of the series, and each section within a rotation presents a reinterpretation of earlier melodic lines and harmonies. Ekpharsis expresses continuous process of reinterpretation on what Berrio would call a different time dimension. Published only 5 years after continuous completion, Ekpharsis adds a new opening based on continuous opening melody. Continuous actual opening follows immediately afterwards, about a minute or so into Ekpharsis. Ekpharsis unfolds 2 rotations of the series identical to continuous. Its third rotation includes an insertion at the end. You can see that it's longer. Yet the third pass of the series remains incomplete. The added material starts in measure 299 and marked with asterisks on this slide. In terms of instrumentation, the orchestra in continuo and Ekpharsis is enclosed on both sides by brass sections marked B1 and B2 in the diagrams of the slide, which are produced from the work scores. However, in Ekpharsis, each group is seated on a 2-meter high podium so that their sounds do not blend with the rest of the orchestra as they did in continuo. In both works, the violins, viola, and high woodwinds are seated in the back, and the cello section and lower woodwinds surround the conductor in the front. Ekpharsis features 1 harp instead of continuous 2, loses continuous English horn, vibraphone, and electric organ, and adds a soprano saxophone and an accordion. Why would Berrio compose 2 works so similar, if not to revise the first into the second? I propose that the closeness between continuo and Ekpharsis reveals Berrio's lifelong practice of compositional performances. Instead of composing open works whose realized forms are created in collaboration with the performer, Berrio takes also the part of performers and produces another kind of open work whose different expressions are created as compositions. Additional support to this idea comes from a mystery related to the CSO recording of Continuo from 1993, which I played earlier. This recording adheres to Continuo's published score until the last 4 minutes or so of the work. The latter are similar but not identical to the score of Ekpharsis, which was not published until 3 years after the CSO recording, with the composition date of 1996. When I visited the Berrio archive in PSS 2 weeks ago, I found 2 conductor scores that were used by Berrio. The first, which has a single sewn thread for its binding, is the version of continuo score that was used in the CSO recording, with the altered ending similar to the ending of Ekpharsis. The second conductor score has a more stable glued binding and plenty of conductor's annotations by Verio, and it is identical to the published version of continuo. It seems then that Verio thought of the two works around the same time as two versions of continuo. He eventually decided to publish both works side by side under different titles. Each of these works, Continuo and Ekpharsis, features an ongoing process of reinterpretation or musical translation. By adding another level of interpretation that expands the boundaries of the earlier work, Ekpharsis turns Continuo from a singular object into one of multiple realizations. Umberto Eco expresses a similar conception in his notion of the open work. Quote, a complete and closed form in its uniqueness as a balanced organic whole, while at the same time constituting an open product on account of its susceptibility to countless different interpretations which do not impinge on its own unadulterated specificity, end quote. While Eco associates openness with certain performative freedoms, Verio's Ekpharsis shows the performative aspect of the composer's practice. Furthermore, in avoiding a radical transformation of continuo of the kind that transformed some sequences into Shaman, Ekpharsis, perhaps more than any other work by Verio, directs listeners' attention to the creative impetus at the core of his musical practice. Thank you.
Much for this terrific presentation. Do you have any questions for Eero?
I just want to say thank you to you because today I've seen the new system and you understanding of the Ekpharsis, and it's really very new for me. And now I don't have any words, but I think I'll have, and we'll be in touch with you. Maybe we will have a little bit collaboration and something like this. But today, just appreciate your presentation, your performance. It was really amazing, and this music is touching.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you.
Yes, I like to thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting. You point out, you showed very specific, very interesting quotes. I really like that idea of shaman, like paths or needs. Which is very interesting that it articulates space in music and architecture. That's what I think we'll be talking about. So I think we will exchange any words afterwards if you want.
Perfect. Sounds good. Thank you.
It's quite interesting when he understands performance, for instance. I mean, it's a way of translating a text, as you commented. And in a way, he made a translation of this first sequenza. It's the same way he did with sequenza 7, but into a harmonization, also metric translation, because the score of the 7 is also geographical score. It's not meters.
Right. He said that every time, he said in an interview that every time he composed the Shaman, it means that it had some questions when he was writing the sequenza that he didn't get to explore in the solo sequenza. So that was an opportunity for him to explore. So I think the radical thing for me was to realize that a single composition is not a work for Verio. For Verio, a work can be a group of compositions. Each one, it's kind of like in architecture, each one provides a different perspective on the same object, in the same way that we can see a building from the inside and the outside. And he was very influenced by ideas from architecture and translation. So yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, good.
Which one is yours, sorry? Which one is this is yours?
Yes, this one or this one. Hello, my name is Eero Tarasti. I'm from Kiev, Ukraine. I want to say thank you for everybody who is present here with and participate with our section, because I know how it's hard to be at the third and fourth and at the end of congress and conference. Today I will present my understanding of musical Ekpharsis. Maybe it's not perfect, but I hope you will be interested in it. So I will begin. The big number of allusions, reminiscences, and quotes in art have transformed contemporary literature and inspired scientists to start fundamental, intermediate, and intertextual research. In this case, Ekpharsis have approved as one of the most complicated and simple terms in literature studies. William James Thomas Mitchell said that the depicting of the Achilles shield in Homer's Iliad is the standard for the art objection description. But why do we use this meaning for Ekpharsis if we have just ordinary description? During more than 2,000 years, a function of Ekpharsis were changed by writers who need new instruments for making their opposites different, unusual, and sometimes mysteries. You can see how the interest of the Ekpharsis decreased during the time. And really, it was very important and necessary to display the culture, cultural diversity in national culture. That's why, while last 10 years research interest in this term increased, you can see yes, from 1990 to 2022, somewhere it's the three part, yes, and the last one is last 10 years. It's a really big progress to see that musical Ekpharsis have affirmed as an equal member in a big family where during a long time only visual arts were approved. One of the most useful scheme for explanation of relationship between music and other fine arts was offered by Sigmund. It shows the intermediate nature of the Ekpharsis and demonstrates all areas of the congress. Some brave researchers made attempts to show the map of links which Ekpharsis consists of, because on there suggest that in modern world Ekpharsis has the intertextual nature, like Mary Roddy presented for us. But other researchers were most conservative and just systemized the main information about the subject and created clear schemes like Valery Robillard and else Joan Grimalt. This classification explains why researchers named so various things the same name. We have to go back to the genesis of this term and to follow the transformation. When the ancient Greeks said that ekpharsis is a type of description or emotional colored rhetorical figure, they used to keep the memory about the described masterpiece. Because at first this term meant jewelry inventory, so ekpharsis created a design and was very close to the eidolon. Nobody knows. Nobody knows when spot world have started as an epoch, but now we know that it lasted till the beginning of the 3rd century AD. James Heffernan suggested to explore ekpharsis as the verbal representation of visual representation. In this case, a recipient ought to see the connection between two opposites and the source of the writer's inspiration. This common assumption exploited non-visual arts and made ekpharsis too like to hypotheses. How to recognize them? If the verbal text includes the special meaning, it turns to ordinary description of the art object, to its symbol. The end of the Cold War gave us the VUCA world, as you can see. Too much information, too less time for catching and analyzing it. That's why Claire Barbety's notion about ekpharsis was that ekpharsis is a verb, not a noun. And it was really good point for the redefinition. Renat Broch determined ekpharsis as a performative gesture, and he discovered that this phenomenon have evolved from the magic element of the narration to the bridge between two different texts. Thus, intersemiotic translation enriches the text plot with the new meanings. Unfortunately, multiply war conflicts and misrepresentation, climate catastrophes, the COVID-19 and renewed sense of vulnerability changed the philosophy. That's why Bunny World is our new reality, where influences make the new context and change the primary meaning of the opus. Sometimes this recontextualization is the instrument for the commemoration, but it is usable for building new myths too. These factors transformed ekpharsis to the narrative unit, the foundation stone, which is showing at the start of the story before narrator and recipient implement it in their own way. Here is the point where discover that writers' purposes define how to use this tool. This handmade scheme can show you if author want to enrich his text with new meaning, to outline something from the verbal text. He or she uses ekpharsis as an element which has out text meanings. But if he or she wants to change reception of well-known story, they use the plot, a system of characters or structure of the original opus. You can see this maybe a little bit complicated scheme, but it shows like equal form of the opus can interact. For example, musical genre ballad, yes, and for example, verbal poem as a ballad. It's different, but it have equal. This one, they have the same form, but it's different fields. Yes, verbal and non-verbal. And here is the same, maybe the same emotionally colored or something with common in history, but they are different with their forms. How does it work? I'd like to show you how it works. For example, on Andrei Lubka's novel. He is Ukrainian novelist, poet, interpreter, and essayist, who was born 1987 at Riga, Latvia. But after his family moved to Ukraine and he lived in a little western town, Vinogradi. 2014, he defended the master's degree at Warsaw University, and now he is living in Uzhgorod, city closely to the border of with Hungary. His third novel, named Your Gaze Churchill Son, was written 2018. It contains a big number of links to author's experience. It's an attempt to change the reception of original plot and create the complicated labyrinth of reflections. First, it is very necessary to admit that it is the ekpharistic novel, not the ekpharsis in text, the part of the text, but it's the form, the gender, yes, of the verbal opus. And so it is very important because we have allusions to the pretext, to the opera Churchill Son, and I think you know the story about presenting this opera by Giacomo Puccini. At first it wasn't successfully, and after he fixed some pieces and he had special guest star, Ukrainian singer, Solomia Krushelnitska, and most of researchers said that her voice, her inspiration helped him to be successful at the second time when he presented the opera to the recipients. I'd like to demonstrate you, I hope. This is her performance. But some of Ukrainian readers are thinking that the author wants to connect Ukrainian history and culture and Western European. But I think maybe if he heard not only at first, but maybe his favorite performance will be by Mansart Kabalia, he wouldn't be so confident that the only Solomia Krushelnitska was the best. and you have the ability to compare that the second performance is more smooth, maybe tranquil and more confident, but the first is more thrilling, excited, and maybe this emotion was the main thing why during most years, Solomia Krushelnitska was the etalon for other singers how to perform this part. But let's return to our novel. The author reconstructed Giacomo Puccini's opera, bringing Madame Butterfly and Lieutenant Pinkerton from Japan to Poland, where Marco, the main character, and his wife Raluca are studying at Warsaw University as author. You can remember, yes, but it's different studies. The author graduated Balkan studies, but the main characters are studying at Roman studies. Both of them are Romanist. That's why, because she is a Roman girl and he is beloved in Roman culture, that's why some part of their love story were bringing from Poland to Romania, from Romania to Ukraine, and it shows us maybe the feelings of Madame Butterfly in opera. It's maybe the second version is something like a spin-off of this story. If Pinkerton will take her to his place, if she will be implemented to Western culture, how it could be. Will it be successful? Maybe yes, maybe no, who knows, but the author considered that no. Of course, his complicated psychology thriller novel, very hard for understanding. It contains some parts of Ukrainian reality, like corruption, like bad justice in different offices and so on, and its alternative story is not good. It ends with the death of the main character who symbolizes Madame Butterfly, and it's the same, it's common, but at the end of this story, writer give us the question. It wasn't verbalized, but we feel that he asked us, was it the murder, as we can read it, because as we can see in the novel, she was killed by a drunk judge when he was driving when he was drunk, but this judge told, I wasn't so drunk, and I have seen that she wanted to die. She came to me. Was it a suicide or was it a murdering? And everybody of us can make their own myth, and because everybody have his own experience in this life and understand the story. Understanding of the story depends of our own stories. That's why the Ekpharsis became from just the expressive description, just rhetorical figure, to something which can change the verbal text from the ordinary story to your own story, your own myth. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering, perhaps I missed something. Is there any specific way in which he tries to verbally somehow reconstruct the musical flow of the? I'll just give you an example. Perhaps the best example I know of this literary Ekpharsis of music would be Anthony Burgess with his, let's say, Mozart and the Wolfgang. He starts, he himself did. And you can really very closely follow his sentences and match the score. Do you find anything like that?
Yes, the structure of the novel seems like the structure of the opera, the original opus, because the drama is playing on our eyes, and we can see the story. We are watching to the story by narrator view. And the narrator is the husband of that woman. How is he understand the story? And he describes the story non-linear. He tells us about their best years, about how they had some problems, about how is he crying now, how it hurts him now, and then he is seeking from, I don't know, maybe some epiphany or some I missed the word, catharsis, because he don't want to feel guilty. He don't want to understand, to know that she wasn't unhappy. And he is going to Romania for looking to the opera, not just this opera. He knew that his wife loved this opera the most. And every time when they visited different European cities, they were at the performance opera or other performance which were connected to this story about Churchill son. And after her death, he decided to go to the Romania, to the Budapest, to see performance which she loved the most. And some pieces hurted him too much, and he just maybe changed his mind and understood that he's really guilty. It's that part of the story which we cannot see in opera. Yes, we just looking how Pinkerton took his son and his concubine made suicide. But here we can see the performance of the scene, and we can see the performance out of the scene when he thinking that he saw his dead wife, and he came out from the hall to catching her, but it was a bad decision. He was drunk. He had some mayors. It wasn't a reality, and so we have the similar construction of this novel, similar to the opera. Maybe if you will have other questions or want to collaborate with me, you have my email. I will be happy if you will text me. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sto copiando una scrittare. En principio tiene que funcionar.
So we have with now Joan Grimalt, who's architect and musician and from Barcelona. He's going to talk about spatial approaches to music signification. Thank you, Joan.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I have to apologize because I think I may be an intruder, an architect talking about music signification and performance. Let me tell you a secret, I'm a musician, so I think that may explain my intrusion. I will talk to you about special approaches to music signification and performance. And let's see that it's special approaches. At the beginning of my research, I was very focused in architecture. And soon I realized that for me, it's very clear the relationship between architecture and space. In fact, for me, architecture is not architecture. Architecture is to deal with space. And many of you as musicians and scholars, you don't know what architecture is, but everyone knows what space is, or this intuitive approach to space. So we will talk about space, not architecture. Okay. Now, for me, as both an architect and a pianist, for me, there are common words that serve both architecture and music. And my research has tried to throw connections between those different words that for me were basically appealing to the same artistic, intuitive, constructive, formal, and in terms of signification model. So I have tried for this presentation to organize so far my different investigations and try to classify it in different types of approaches. Let me start with the very first one, I mean a physical approach, which is the instrument's architectural space, which lets sound to be born and to be surrounded by space. That's a very initial approach, but it's an approach, it's a physical approach. I mean, we need space. Even electronic music needs kind of think about the space and to virtually design it, but there's a physical approach to music and architecture. Second one could be what I would call a performative approach in terms of this dialogue between subject and pre-existent object. Like, let's make a very quick example. Like in architecture, you deal with a pre-existent object. Let's say that you have a tree, okay? Then you decide that's a pre-existent object, and then you decide how your new building will fit in with this context. So the new text has to deal with the context. So, for example, you can surround the tree, you can have a patio scheme architecture around a courtyard, for instance. If we looked at that in section, I mean, you would have this tree, and maybe your building could do this. Maybe not. Maybe would respect it and take a step back. But we really deal with pre-existence. Now, in music, that's the everyday life of a performer. Let's take as an example this piece by Catalan composer Montbou, The Fountain and the Bell, in the cycle Landscape. Let me say that the word landscape, when it appears in music, it's of course filled with these special approaches or pictorial and landscape approach. Murray Schafer talks about soundscape. So there's a In the first presentation, we also found the word soundscape in channel video. And in this kind of relationship between the subject and the object, for instance, in Monpeau, at the very first one, we can find a reading type relationship. Like we have a pre-existent material, and as a performer, we just read it, which of course demands us a very important effort, because for a performer, just to read, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to try to just objectively read a pre-existent material. Now, in the next measures of the piece, we find this listening relationship, which is very challenging for performance because it really asks us to first play, then listen. And it very often carries a more collective dimension of music material. And the third type of relationship between subject and object, or pre-existent object, would be a more spontaneous comment, more improvised material. Which, by the way, we can hear here, Chianti. So, in fact, I've tried to classify that in real time everything takes place at the same time and at the same place. But for me to analyze it, I have done an effort to try to classify it in different approaches. A third approach that I will not comment today, just announce it here, is the one that I talked about in Kaunas in Lithuania about humanities, which deals with this creative approach, and as the art of suggesting, not imposing. And the duality in architecture, we talk about form and design, which has nothing to do with musical form. Like architectural design could be the structure, the more formal dimension as we speak as musicians. But I'm really interested in this more conceptual, more signification dimension, more an unmaterial dimension, which is formed in architecture. Now, a third approach could be a constructive approach. And I will show here you a piece that I composed taking this olive tree from the Joan Mirós courtyard, the Joan Mirós Museum in Barcelona. I did an investigation on sound creation. I took a course in that foundation. And I finally composed this piece, which is called 6 Variations on the Olive Tree Courtyard, 6 Variacions sobre el Pati de l'Olivera, that try to approach the same object in very different ways. The object would be the olive tree courtyard. Now, the first recording you will hear corresponds to variation number 1, which is directly sound, the ambient sound of the courtyard. Now, second variation is called altered ambient sound. Why altered? Because at that time in the courtyard there was an artistic sound installation by Lawrence Lawler, which you will be able to hear birds singing, but those birds are not natural. Those birds were in this artist's recording. So that's the very first alteration of the courtyard. Now, variation number 3 is called the olive tree through sound. That's because I put a microphone in the tree and I stretch it. So now you can hear the chordal sound through the tree. Variation number 4 is called the 3D model sound. That's because in the exhibition there was a three-dimensional model of the building. And I put a microphone in that and I touched the walls that were enclosing the podium. And now, sorry. Variation number 6, finally, is this constructive approach in the second mode. Variation number 6, what I did is I took a plan of the building, a section plan, and I translated it into sound, a MIDI sound plan. And I just did a very sound approach. I mean, what you will hear, I don't like to call it music. It's just a sound translation of that plan. But it's very interesting. As you can hear, it's the void of the podium. And you can hear also the descending lines that correspond to the staircase at the beginning and to this integration or relationship between the building and the street at the end. So as I was saying, this is a sound piece. Next step that I want to make is to take this sound material and to work on it and maybe get to a music composition, exploiting these signification elements. Now, another approach would be really a semantic approach, because music, we are very used to it, but when we really think about it, every one of us, we use words. They have a lot to do with space. Like when you find character indications of peu à peu sortant de la brume, getting out from the fog, or dans la sonorité du début, in the beginning sound, in the sound, dans une brume doucement sonore, in a sweetly sound fog, perdendosi, getting lost. I mean, yes, I guess we can get lost in time, but for me, you really get lost in space, maybe both space and time. So I will just show to you very quickly many images, architectural images, trying to illustrate musical spatial references that everyone uses, every one of us use. First one would be when we talk about gesture, density and weight for space. Let's take, for instance, the beginning of La Cathédrale en Boutique, Sunken Cathedral by Debussy. It's very different how, as performance, we deal with space in these very first notes. I mean, gesture is very important. It's very different to play it like this, play it like this, play it like this. And for me, the difference is gesture, is to be aware of space and weight in a very physical manner, but also a very conceptual manner, because we have to imagine the sound before we play. Second, semantics would be when we talk about intervallic distance. I mean, it's distance, and for me as a performer, it's very different to play an interval passage, being aware of that physical distance, special distance between notes, or not being aware of that. Let's take, for instance, this fragment from Ballet de Barman by Liszt. Now, when we also talk about tonal space, when we have this feeling that tonally music goes away, and then there's a moment that it comes back. For me, this is a really, in terms of experience, it's a very special relationship with sound material. And for instance, let's take this example from Grieg's Son de Cloche. You can hear how the sound comes forward and then goes away, and we finally come back to place. Then, when we talk about music as performance, we deal with very different layers of material, and we have to establish hierarchies to decide what is more important than the other, to try to establish connections between material. And for me, it's very useful to think about topography, as in architecture, or in a mountain has a topography, which corresponds to think about a mountain as a superposition of different layers in different heights. Then when you add them up, you obtain a 3D model of them. So for me, to think about music as in texture and sound tracks has a lot to do with, for example, this territorial topography. Then when we talk about melodic direction, the duality between movement and momentum, kinetic energy and potential energy. In physics, energy just transforms. So we have a lot of movement that then comes out to be a more potential energy. For me, it's very useful to think about these special or physics concepts as movement and momentum. Let's take, for instance, you see something particular again. We have in this right hand this movement material that then suddenly becomes more potential energy passage. And for me, I think about a door, like an actual door. A door is just when space gets very narrow, so it has that amount of energy has to go through it. And for me, this moment, it's like an architectonical door. Now, when we also talk about light and darkness, it's very useful to think about spatial qualities, and I'm using this image from the Pantheon. And as I was saying at the beginning, all these references, words that appeal to spatial qualities of music, for me are very interesting and very insightful. Now, just to end my presentation, I will expose you this last approach, which I called it a phenomenological approach. I don't know if this is the word is exactly that, but I think it could work. For me, it's like this approach that deals with a real-time dialogue between sound and space. Since I graduated from ESMUC, lately I have done a lot of improvisation. I will show you a couple of videos at the end of the presentation. For me, I have come up with the fact that for me improvisation is very useful because it allows me to get a real-time dialogue with space, to interact and to try to experience different qualities of space in real time. And when I think about it, I mean, it comes up this duality between the diachronic and synchronic time. It's very clear that music deals with both qualities of time. Sometimes we have materials that have a very precise direction. I mean, here I also have cyclical because I'm repeating it, but it's a very diachronic time. It has a direction. But you also find this more synchronic. Schubert have many examples of a more cyclic. So for me, when you look at it, for me, when time comes to be synchronic, we're not thinking about time. We're thinking about sound qualities. Space gets into the equation very easily. So for me, I've tried to find where and how, in what terms, music becomes special, and try to answer that question. Taking back one of the very first ideas, I have come across that it very often comes when the listening relationship and the collective dimension that I was talking at the beginning, because that's when time finds this empty space, or space finds this infinite time, and sound can expand from itself. And this duality between synchronic and diachronic, I mean, we have lots of examples. There's the classical difference between the aria duet when action stops, the opera, or the recitativo when action moves. Now, time, for instance, stops by collapse. Let's take this example from Ballet d'Obermann. Collapse of time is one of the mechanisms, I think, that it's how space comes into the equation. Another one could be direct superposition of elements, and that's everyday life. When you have this diachronic material, when we start to have different layers, we really are beginning maybe to create a spatial dimension. But when it gets really interesting is when what we superpose is temporalities. Let's take, for instance, this example from Monpou as well, Música #1. He intentionally writes without bar lines, so that's one of the decisions. But he marks these phrases. Let's take the right hand, this more directional movement. Then in the left hand, we have these suspended notes with no bar lines. That's a different temporality. And when we superpose them, when we overlay them at the same time, for me, when this occurs, music becomes really special. Now, we also find different approaches, mechanisms by which this timeline gets alterated. One of them can be this fragmentation or destabilization of the musical discourse, as we find in Greek nocturnes. These lines that announce a direction that breaks down, and then there's another one. So there's this destabilization or fragmentation of the discourse. We have also this more cubist approach of this integration of music, as we heard, for instance, in that example, the variation number 6, for instance, about the patio. It's a very cubist approach, more this integrated sound material. And at the very end, there is this another mechanism that's when music tries to reverse itself. We have the palindrome figure that exists in music. Just to take the same piece I was talking about by Debussy. Tries to find its way through space. And for me, there's a very important difference between space and time, is that space, when you enter space, when you enter this, you can walk around in infinite directions. You have this grade of freedom. Music, we read it from left to right. Palindrome tries to read it from right to left. But for me, it's very interesting to find different ways in which music tries to open new directions, more than forward and backwards. And for me, thinking about space would be a very useful strategy. And now, to end, I will show you 2 videos. Let me see if this works. No, I will show it to you directly from here. This is an intervention, an award-winning 2016. We filled the space with cotton strings, and you were able to walk through that space. Music is mine as well, and I like to think about this architecture that's made for the people, that kind of architecture space that can be lived, as well as this humane approach to music and signification allows me to do that. When other approaches doesn't allow me to do that, so they are so interesting for me. And I want to think about architecture as this experience of the ultimate user of the space, has more ethical and just to end. We lost it. Okay, sorry. I will show you a very last example of an artistic intervention we did a year ago. We put a piano in the middle of an old industrial building here in Barcelona, and it was music improvisation by myself. We had dance choreography where eventually the public also were an active part of that choreography, and poems recital at the same time. That was a very insightful experience for me because it let me interact with space in real time, and with movement through the bands of the elements. As you will see in the second one, so well, I hope that to the very first question about what is an architect doing, talking about here, talking in a Music Signification Congress, I hope that both you and we have found maybe a possible answer to that. Thank you very much.
I have so many things I want to say. Thanks so much. It was great. Yeah, music in space is very strange, right? Because it's, in architecture, we're looking at space, and music, we're hearing space. Do you think at all about cognition, how the brain does that? Because I work in cognition and signification and semiotics. But have you looked at all at what the brain's doing when we're building a musical object in the mind, this virtual space? There's a few like principles that the brain does. One of them is with pitch. We map pitch onto height, right? We think a high pitch, but that's very strange because the pitch is not high. It's not in space, right? It's fast. It's a fast or it's slow, but we automatically map it onto high and low. It's called the SMART effects, Spatial Musical Association Response Code, I think is what that stands for. But do you think at all about cognition in space?
Well, of course, it must be, there is a clear relationship in terms of cognition and neurological, which I'm not an expert on that, of course, but let me say that for me it's very difficult to make an affirmation as you did, for me personally, because when I see or hear space, I don't approach it from architecture or from music, you know. For me, you said that in architecture we see space. For me, in architecture, when I enter space, I do that to hear space. You know.
Sure.
So I mean, yeah, of course. I think that music and architecture are different ways to approach space, time, and at least it's the user's experience. But I think that's something, there's something very interesting is that in the last part of your intervention, I think that for years, or many of the music theory, the way we describe pitch in terms of height, if you go to the origin, it goes to the fact that to deal with the transcription of music, like the visualization of music, the score. I don't know, maybe if scores did not exist ever, I don't know if we would talk about speech as in terms of height. because it's very literal, you know. You see a score, you say that's higher and that's lower. I don't know, maybe if scores didn't exist, I don't know how, if pitch height relationship would exist or not. I don't know, because I think it's a direct consequence of the visualization of music, because we have to find a way to transcribe and to visualize it in order to be able to transmit it. I think that's necessary. So I think I didn't understand, I didn't answer you, but yeah, those are really important issues that need to be dealt with.
I impressed a lot, you know, this connection between static and phonics elements. It's really amazing thing. But I don't have enough words to describe my feelings. And you know, maybe I suppose something. Maybe it's not right, but it seems like human. All of these people in performance are like medium between the non-material from the music to the material elements. This
ropes.
Ropes, yes, ropes, yes, which are hanging. They became alive because people were going through them. So human created all of this. The live music and not well live elements of the which space consists of, but human make the interaction between them. Yes, it's the creator and it's the performer. Yes, no, maybe so.
Yes, it's a really difficult question. I mean, because even in music, you have the performer, you have the listener. We have the musical persona, which is not the composer, or yes, I mean, it's another actor. We have intertextual actors, author references. So it really is, in both cases, music and architecture, a really complex network of actors and references. And thing is, how, in what dimension, in what medium does this this network take place? And the time, the expression to take place, also needs a time. But we also take place. For me, it's take place and time at the same time in the same place. But it's interesting. I mean. Dealing with different actors. First of all, we have to identify them in order to be able to analyze their different roles in a discourse.
Yes, and the contemporary dance it allows different understanding different styles inside it, and so they are the one, yes, but all of them are unique.
Mm-hmm.
Very beautiful and impressive.
I would like to suggest another perspective. To get back to your previous discussion, the way architecture and music deals with space. Now, of course, you can observe architectural objects somehow from a distance. An object in space, you can be inside it, completely enveloped by the space. You're inside the space. And that's something that the ear creates much better than the eye. You have this, the concept of sonorous bubble, sonorous bed, you're completely bathed in music. And eye is much more focused, much more directed. So in that sense, music is very spatial, particularly at certain moments when we are really very much moved by music. There is this expression, the static peak experience. You really feel you're identifying with, you're completely enveloped with the work of art. And it is now accidental music induces that feeling more often than any other. But with architecture, you sometimes have this overwhelming feeling when you're inside something.
Yes. Following on that argument, in the case of the sixth variation piece, what I did there was to go from a plan to sound. A project I have in mind, if I wanted to carry it out soon, is to go from sound to a plan. Okay, let's take, for instance, a recording, and to make it work the other way, and from a recording, from sound, obtain a plan, process it somehow, and then maybe build a sound, a physical model of that sound that would let us enter that space. Because I would like to experience the action of getting in music. That's an idea that I have in mind. But one of the challenges that artistic intervention offers is that music, I mean, you just hear it, okay? Architecture, representation of architectural space, I mean, that was just one plan of a building. And in order to represent that building, that real building, you can make infinite number of plans. Then my question would be to myself, and why did you do just that plan and not another one? Because the building is the building, such as music is the music we hear. So that's one of my inner struggles.
As a barrier.
You know? It's very difficult, very difficult, very difficult. But maybe this experiment could maybe offer not an answer, but another question.
Yeah, that's what it's all about.
Yes.
Yeah, about the plan that you just showed in the MIDI, the translation, you know, the conversion.
Yes.
The correspondence with the blueprint to MIDI. You probably know yourself as an architect, the work of Yanis Xenakis with the looping system. So he draws, you know, the design and makes music with it. So basically, it's all synthesized through some sort of algorithmic procedures that is done doing like stochastic processes as an architect to think how proportionally it could refers to music. But my question is here, what's the musical MIDI piano keyboard as a reference?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Did you ask yourself the questions in terms of sound parameters? There are 4 sound parameters, but now they say that the space is a sound parameter. They define it this way. So if you could maybe translate through timbre rather than frequencies.
Yes, yes, yes. A more static point of view.
Probably another dimension to the physical model you are trying to reach. And basically, it's what Xenakis tried. But I would refer more to sound than to music. You know, in the examples that you were proposed to listening to, I was just questioned about the very tonal aspect of it, which would refer to me to sort of mood rather than a real objective translation of the kinesthetic relationship that you can have between sound and form, as you mentioned it, or sound and space, and sound and colors, and sound and and proportions. So it's like more ambient types of music rather than what we call today sound art or even sound design. To occupy the space and to work out the functional aspect of it.
Yes, that's a very interesting point. Like music has this, again, when music tries to represent itself, we have this possibility to show pitch by time, or more the stationary graphs that more deal with frequencies and not time dimension, and that gives more quality or what makes an instrument different from another one, which is very interesting. Vous avez some research on le son crépusculaire that Eero talked about the clarinet, and you can see that it has a different stationary like pitch, not pitch but timbre qualities. So that's another direction of research. About what you said, that the examples were very tonal. I have to say that I studied classical music here in ESMUC, so but I really want to avoid to think that space can only be present in terms of non-tonal music regarding all the research and theory that has already been done. But for me, as a classical music performer, I can feel the space. So my struggle is to try to analyze classify the different ways in which, when we hear some kind of music, tonal music, it doesn't have to be tonal in order to take place. We can say this is special. I can see space here, and then I want to see how do we get to that.
What do you think? Oh, sorry, we have time. What do you think? So looking at this, there's the obvious correlation between height and pitch, right? So as the building goes down, the pitch goes down. And there's the correlation of duration. The longer a line exists, the longer the duration of the pitch. And we talked a little bit about timbre, which I think we use the term color a lot. So that would be the correlation of that. What do you think, how do you think you might implement depth, which I think would be dynamic volume? Like here we have no depth, right?
Yes.
How did you decide, or have you thought about how you're going to decide how dynamic is involved?
This plan was very direct. Every line has the same value. In architecture, we talk about line value when you draw. It's thicker or lighter. If you make more pressure on the pencil or less pressure, so that could be another one. But technically, very difficult.
If I can jump in, there is an interesting position that harmony can play in this, specific role that the harmony can play, or any kind of simultaneous sonority. On one hand, we can somehow experience that as providing depth to music, but also there is this coloristic. We often speak about harmony coloring this or that way. So it's a bit ambiguous how harmony works in that sense, but it could also be associated with that.
Yes. Yes. I think that color in music, its analogy in architecture could also work with light, more or less light in spaces. That's a very common, but we also use coloring in architecture. So, yes.
Can I add something? For that, people might play they have so they can feel the vibration under the feet and inside their body when it's drum and bass. Yes, they can feel it and it's very good. So I think we can not only for depth but for blinded people too. We can show them maybe it's just suppose again. We can show them the dynamics or maybe the size of the space by rhythmic, by rhythmic picture, something, yes, or by frequency of this beats or vibrations, and they can feel how it go close to them or far to them, and so on.
Yes. Yes. One of the, I mean, many times I ask myself, what's the purpose of this? So for me, it's very clear that I have a purpose: performing, and create, to show, to be able to listen to that. So that's the purpose. But another one that I have also thought is maybe approaching architecture by means of music or sound can really be a means for blind people to experience space that they cannot see, but they can hear it. So that could be a very interesting purpose of this research.